Hello, this is David Sneathen with Alpha Omega Revelation. We're reading The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We're on chapter 8, which is part of his Sermon on the Mount section. And this is chapter 8, The Righteousness of Christ. Let me go ahead and get started. Think not that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I came not to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass away from the law, till all things be accomplished. Whosoever therefore shall break one of the least commandments, and shall teach men so, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, ye shall in no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:17 through 20. It is not at all surprising that the disciples imagined that the law had been abrogated when Jesus made promises like this. For these promises reversed all popular notions of right and wrong, and pronounced a blessing on all that was accounted worthless. Jesus spoke to his disciples and described them as men who now possessed all things through the sovereign grace of God, as heirs apparent of the kingdom of heaven. They enjoy perfect communion with Christ, who had made all things new. They are the salt, the light, the city set on the hill. The old life is dead and done with. How tempting, then, to suppose that Jesus would give the old order its coup de grace by repealing the law of the old covenant and pronounce his followers free to enjoy the liberty of the Son of God. After all, Jesus had said the disciples might well have thought like Marcion, who accused the Jews of tampering with the text and altering it too. Think ye that I am come to fulfill the law and the prophets? I am not come to fulfill, but to destroy. Many others since Marcion have read and expounded this saying of Jesus as if that were what he said. But Jesus said, You must not imagine that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. And so saying, he vindicates the authority of the law of the old covenant. How is this to be understood? We know that Jesus is speaking to his own followers, to men who owe an exclusive allegiance to himself. He had allowed no law to act as a barrier to his fellowship with his disciples. We saw that when we were dealing with Luke 9:57. Discipleship means adherence to Jesus Christ alone and immediately. But now comes the surprise. The disciples are bound to the Old Testament law. This has a double significance. First, it means that adherence to the law is something quite different from the following of Christ. And secondly, it means that any adherence to his person that disregards the law is equally removed from the following of him. It is, however, Jesus himself who points to the law, those to whom he has granted his whole promise and his whole fellowship. Because it is their Lord who does this, they are bound to acknowledge the law. The question inevitably arises, which is our final authority, Christ or the law? To which we are bound? To which are we bound? Christ had said that no law was to be allowed to come between him and his disciples. Now he tells us that to abandon the law would be to separate ourselves from him. What exactly does he mean? The law Jesus refers to is the law of the Old Covenant, not a new law, but the same law which he quoted to the rich young man and the lawyer when he wanted to know the revealed will of God. It becomes a new law only because it is Christ who binds his followers to it. For Christians, therefore, the law is not a better law than that of the Pharisees, but one and the same. Every letter of it, every jot and tittle, must remain in force and be observed until the end of the world. But there is a better righteousness which is expected of Christians. Without it, none can enter into the kingdom of heaven, for it is the indispensable condition of discipleship. None can have this better righteousness but those to whom Christ is speaking here, those whom he has called. The call of Christ, in fact, Christ himself, is the sine qua non of this better righteousness. Excuse, I don't have very good Latin, so my bad. Sine qua non is probably closer. Of this better righteousness. Now we can see why up to now Jesus has said nothing about himself in the Sermon on the Mount. Between the disciples and the better righteousness demanded of them stands the person of Christ, who came to fulfill the law of the Old Covenant. This is the fundamental presupposition of the whole Sermon on the Mount. Jesus manifests his perfect union with the will of God as revealed in the Old Testament law and prophets. He has, in fact, nothing to add to the commandments of God except this, that he keeps them. He fulfills the law, and he tells us so himself, therefore it must be true. He fulfills the law down to the last iota, but that means that he must die. He alone understands the true nature of the law as God's law. The law is not itself God, nor is God the law. It was the error of Israel to put the law in God's place, to make the law their God, and their God a law. The disciples were confronted with the opposite danger from denying the law, its divinity altogether, and divorcing God from the law, from his law. Both errors lead to the same result. By confounding God and the law, the Jews were trying to use the law to exploit the lawgiver. He was swallowed up in the law and therefore no longer its Lord. By imagining that God and the law could be divorced from one another, the disciples were trying to exploit God by their possession of salvation. In both cases, the gift was confounded with the giver. God was denied equally, whether it was with the help of the law or with the promise of salvation. Confronted with these twin errors, Jesus vindicates the divine authority of the law. God is the giver and its Lord. God is its giver and its Lord, and only in personal communion with God is the law fulfilled. There is no fulfillment of the law apart from communion with God, and no communion with God apart from fulfillment of the law. To forget the first condition was the mistake of the Jews. To forget the second, the temptation of the disciples. Jesus, the Son of God, who alone lives in perfect communion with him, vindicates the law of the Old Covenant by coming to fulfill it. He was the only man who ever fulfilled the law, and therefore he alone can teach the law and its fulfillment aright. The disciples would naturally grasp that as soon as he told them, for they knew who he was, but the Jews could not grasp it as long as they refused to believe in him. It was thus only to be expected that they would reject his teaching on the law. To them it was blasphemy against God, because it was blasphemy against his law. Jesus, the champion of the true law, must suffer at the hands of the champions of the false law. He dies on the cross as a blasphemer, a transgressor of the law, because he has vindicated the true against the false. The only way for him to fulfill the law is by dying a sinner's death on the cross. There he embodies in his person the perfect fulfillment of the law. That is to say, Jesus Christ, and he alone fulfills the law, because he alone lives in perfect communion with God. It is Jesus himself who comes between the disciples and the law, not the law which comes between Jesus and the disciples. They find their way to the law through the cross of Christ. Thus, by pointing his disciples to the law which he alone fulfills, he forges a further bond between himself and them. He must needs reject the notion that men can cleave to him and be free from the law, for that spells enthusiasm, and so far from leading to adherence to Jesus means libertarianism. But this allays the disciples' anxiety that adherence to the law would sever them from Jesus. Such an anxiety could only spring from that self-same error which cut off the Jews from God. Instead, the disciples now learn that genuine adherents to Christ also means adherence to the law of God. But if Jesus comes between the disciples and the law, he does so not to cleanse them from the duties it imposes, but to validate his demand that they should fulfill it. Just because they are bound to him, they must obey the law as he does. The fact that Jesus has fulfilled the law down to the very last letter does not release them from the same obedience. The law is fulfilled, that is all. But it is precisely this which makes it properly valid for the first time. That is why he who obeys and teaches the law will be great in the kingdom of heaven. Do and teach. We are reminded that it is possible to teach the law without fulfilling it, to teach it in such a way that it cannot be fulfilled. That sort of teaching has no warrant from Jesus. The law will be obeyed as certainly as he obeyed it himself. If men cleave to him who fulfilled the law and follow him, they will find themselves both teaching and fulfilling the law. Only the doer of the law can remain in communion with Jesus. It is not the law which distinguishes the disciples from the Jews, but the better righteousness. The righteousness of the disciples, we are told, exceeds that of the scribes. That is because it is something extraordinary and unusual. This is the first time we meet the word perisenion, to exceed, which is so important in verse 47. Excuse me, it's written in Greek, so I had to sound it out. We must ask, how exactly does the righteousness of the Pharisees differ from that of the disciples? Certainly, the Pharisees never imagined that the law must be taught but not obeyed. They knew their Bibles better than that. No, it was rather their ambition to be doers of the law. Their idea of righteousness was a direct, literal, and practical fulfillment of the commandment. Their ideal was to model their behavior exactly on the demands of the law. Of course, they knew that they could never realize that ideal. There was bound to be an excess which needs forgiveness of sins to cover it. Their obedience was never more than imperfect. With the disciple also righteous could only take the form of obedience to the law. No one who failed to do the law could be accounted righteous, but the disciple had the advantage over the Pharisee in that his doing of the law is in fact perfect. How is such a thing possible? Because between the disciples and the law stands one who has perfectly fulfilled it, one with whom they live in communion. They are faced not with a law which has never yet been fulfilled, but with one whose demands have already been satisfied. The righteousness it demands is already there, the righteousness of Jesus which submits to the cross, because that is what the law demands. This righteousness is therefore not a duty owed, but a perfect and truly personal communion with God. And Jesus not only possesses this righteousness, but is himself the personal embodiment of it. He is the righteousness of the disciples. By calling them, he has admitted them to partnership with himself and made them partakers of his righteousness in its fullness. That is what Jesus means when he prefaces his teaching on the better righteousness with reference to his own fulfillment of the law. Of course, the righteousness of the disciples can never be a personal achievement. It is always a gift which they received when they were called to follow him. In fact, their righteousness consists precisely in their following him, and in the Beatitudes the reward of the kingdom of heaven has been promised to it. It is a righteousness under the cross. It belongs only to the poor, the tempted, the hungry, the meek, the peacemakers, the persecuted, who endure their lot for the sake of Jesus. It is the visible righteousness of those who, for the sake of Jesus, are the light of the world and the city set on the hill. This is where the righteousness of the disciples exceeds that of the Pharisees. It is grounded solely upon the call to fellowship with him who alone fulfills the law. Their righteousness is righteousness indeed. Far from henceforth they do the will of God and fulfill the law themselves. Again, it is not enough to teach the law of Christ. It must be done. Otherwise, it is no better than the old law. In what follows, the disciples are told how to practice this righteousness of Christ. In a word, it means following him. It is the real and active faith in the righteousness of Christ. It is the new law, the law of Christ. And that's the end of chapter 8. So after that, we are going to be beginning, and it goes through a lot of the commandments, and we'll talk about that more when we get through those. So I hope that you're enjoying Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of my favorites, The Cost of Discipleship, and we'll see you again next time with chapter 9. Thanks.